Chicago, 1994. In a quiet, working-class neighborhood, a 17-year-old girl with a voice full of promise vanished after choir rehearsal. Her father, a man respected for his quiet dignity and devotion, told the city she had run away with an older boy. The city believed him. For 13 months, he accepted their pity and their prayers, a portrait of a heartbroken parent. But the truth was hidden just beneath their feet, in a dark, silent room where a daughter's trust was being systematically destroyed. No one ever imagined the man they all looked up to was the monster she could never look away from. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you the story. To the congregation of the First Baptist Church of Auburn, Earl Whitaker was a monument to quiet suffering, a man in his late 40s. He carried the grief of his wife's death 5 years prior, not as a burden, but as a part of his very architecture, like the sturdy, weathered brick of the church he so diligently maintained. He was the handyman, a role that suited his reserved nature. He was a man of few words, his presence felt in the silent competence of a repaired step, a freshly painted wall, or a floor buffed to a reverent shine. People saw him as a good man, a hard-working widower doing the best he could for his daughter Danielle. On Sunday mornings, they would sit together in the third pew from the front, a tableau of paternal devotion. His hand would rest on her shoulder, a gesture the community saw as protective, a father shielding his only child from a world that had already taken so much. They would nod in approval, their hearts aching for the quiet man and his beautiful, talented daughter. From beneath that heavy, calloused hand, Danielle saw a different picture. The weight of his touch was not protective. It was proprietary. It was a constant, physical reminder of his ownership, a silent command to stay put. The sympathy the congregation poured over her father felt less like a comfort and more like the bars of a gilded cage, each pitying glance another lock on the door. She would smile, a polite, practiced expression, while her heart screamed for a key. She loved her father, or at least, she loved the memory of the man he was when her mother was alive. But his grief had not softened him. It had calcified, turning him into something hard and unyielding. The man the world saw as a devoted father was, in the suffocating silence of their small home, a warden, his love a form of constant, unnerving surveillance. Danielle's life had two distinct soundtracks. The first was the sound of her father's quiet, oppressive presence at home, the deliberate click of his keys on the counter, the heavy, measured tread of his footsteps, the unnerving silence that followed any mention of her future. The second, and the only one that truly made her feel alive, was the sound of her own voice, soaring to the rafters of the church sanctuary. The choir was her sanctuary within the sanctuary, the one place where she was not just Earl Whitaker's daughter, but herself. When she sang, the knot of anxiety in her stomach would loosen, and for a few precious hours a week, she could breathe. Her voice was a gift, a powerful, soulful soprano that could convey a depth of emotion that her carefully guarded expression never betrayed. Music was her passion, but it was also the engine of her escape. Her dream was to attend college, to study music education, and become a teacher. It was a simple, noble ambition, but in the context of her life, it was a revolutionary act. College wasn't just about a career. It was a declaration of independence, a ticket to a life where she could close her own door, make her own choices, and breathe her own air. One afternoon, sitting on a park bench with her best friend Sarah, the dream felt tantalizingly real. They pored over college brochures, their fingers tracing the outlines of ivy-covered buildings and smiling, diverse student bodies. Danielle's face was alight with a hope so pure and bright it was almost painful to watch. "Can you imagine it, Sarah?" she'd whispered, her voice full of awe. "Just being somewhere else? Being someone else?" That evening, the dream collided with reality. She had left one of the brochures on her desk, an oversight born of a moment of careless joy. Earl found it. He didn't shout. He never shouted. He simply walked into the living room where she was doing her homework and placed the glossy pamphlet on the table in front of her, as if it were a piece of damning evidence. "Your mother always said this house was our world," he said. his voice a low, mournful rumble. She believed in family, in staying together. He wasn't talking about the brochure. He was talking about her desire to leave. He was framing her ambition as a betrayal, a desecration of her mother's memory. The room grew cold, his quiet, wounded disappointment a more effective weapon than any outburst could ever be. He was reminding her of her duty, not as a daughter, but as a memorial to the woman he had lost. In his eyes, her dream of a future was an act of profound selfishness, and he was making her feel the full, crushing weight of that invented sin. The final choir rehearsal before the Sunday service was always Danielle's favorite. It was a Thursday night, the air outside cool and crisp with the promise of autumn. Inside the warm, wood-paneled sanctuary, she felt a sense of peace she found nowhere else. They were practicing a new hymn, and as her voice joined the others, rising in a harmony that felt both powerful and holy, she closed her eyes. For a moment, she was not a girl trapped in a cage of her father's grief. She was just a voice, free and soaring. The feeling lingered even after the last note had faded. She was laughing with Sarah and the choir director, a rare, unguarded moment of joy when she saw him. Her father was standing in the shadows at the back of the church, his figure a dark, still silhouette against the stained glass doors. Her laughter died in her throat. He was just waiting to take her home, a normal, fatherly act. But the sight of him filled her with a sudden, icy dread. The walk to the car was silent. He didn't speak, and that was always worse than his words. The silence was a living thing, a passenger in the car with them, thick with a tension that made the air feel thin and hard to breathe. He didn't drive them home. Instead, he pulled into the church's rear parking lot, the space reserved for maintenance, and cut the engine. The only light came from a single, flickering security lamp high on the brick wall. "You were happy in there," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "It was a good rehearsal, Daddy," she replied, her voice small. "You like it there more than you like being at home with me," he continued, his voice still unnervingly calm, but laced with a deep, wounded sorrow. "You're planning on leaving me, just like she did." "That's not true," she cried, the injustice of the comparison to her dead mother a sharp, sudden pain. "I'm not leaving you. I just want to go to college. It's what Mom would have wanted." The mention of her mother was a mistake. She saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of the warm, familiar grief she knew so well. But then it was gone, replaced by something else, something cold and hard and terrifyingly possessive. "Your mother isn't here to want anything," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There's only us now, and I won't lose you too." Before she could process the finality in his tone, he moved. His movements were quick, efficient, the practiced motions of a man who knew how to handle heavy things. He reached across the seat, his handyman's grip like iron on her arm. Her protest was a strangled gasp, a sound swallowed by the sudden, shocking reality of the situation. This was her father, her protector, and he was looking at her with the eyes of a stranger, a jailer who had just decided to lock the final door. Her trust, the foundational bedrock of her entire world, shattered in that single, violent moment. The next morning, Earl Whitaker walked through the glass doors of the 4th District Police Station. He had dressed for the part. A slightly worn work shirt, clean but not pressed, and an expression of profound, exhausted despair. He approached the front desk, his shoulders slumped, his eyes red-rimmed from a night of what appeared to be sleepless, tearful anxiety. He looked every inch the heartbroken father at the end of his rope. He told the desk sergeant he needed to report a runaway. He was ushered into a small, sterile interview room where a detective named Morris, a tired, cynical veteran, listened to his story with a practiced, weary patience. Earl's performance was a masterpiece of deception. He spoke in a low, halting voice, pausing frequently to compose himself. To run a trembling hand over his face, he painted a vivid, plausible picture of a good girl who had fallen in with a bad crowd. "Her name is Danielle," he began, his voice thick with a carefully crafted sorrow. "She's a good kid, always has been. But this last year, she's changed. There's a boy, an older boy. I don't know his name. She's been sneaking out to see him. He drives a loud, beat-up car. He's got tattoos. He was creating a phantom, a convenient, stereotypical villain, onto whom all blame could be projected. The older boyfriend was a classic trope, a story that police in a working-class district had heard 1,000 times before. It was a narrative that required no imagination and no real investigation. "We argued last night," Earl continued, looking down at his calloused hands as if in shame. "I told her I didn't approve of him, that she was throwing her future away. She got angry, said I couldn't control her life. She packed a bag, and she left. I think she's with him." Detective Morris nodded, his expression one of weary sympathy. He saw a familiar story: a single father, trying his best, and a rebellious teenage daughter, making foolish, impulsive choices. Earl's quiet dignity, his apparent grief, it all fit. He was the victim here. "Happens all the time," Morris said, his tone meant to be reassuring. "She'll get tired of this guy in a week or two and come home with her tail between her legs. I just want to know she's safe," Earl whispered, the perfect, poignant final touch. The detective took down the information, but the sense of urgency was non-existent. This wasn't a crime, it was a domestic drama. No Amber Alert would be issued. No citywide search would be launched. Earl's story had provided them with an easy, convenient explanation that required minimal paperwork and no real allocation of resources. The case of Danielle Whitaker was officially classified as a voluntary juvenile disappearance. It was filed away, not as a potential tragedy, but as a predictable teenage cliché. Earl had not just lied to the police. He had given them a story they were predisposed to believe, a narrative that allowed their own biases and systemic indifference to do the rest of the work for him. The investigation was over before it had ever truly begun. While the world above accepted her erasure, Danielle woke to a living nightmare. Her first sensation was the cold, damp air, thick with the smell of mildew, decaying paper, and the faint, sweet scent of old incense. She was lying on a thin, lumpy mattress on a concrete floor. The darkness was absolute. A heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in on her from all sides. Panic seized her, a raw, animal terror that made her scramble upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. She called out for her father, her voice a raw, croaking sound in the oppressive silence. A single, bare bulb flickered on, suspended from a wire overhead, casting long, grotesque shadows across the small, windowless room. The space was a forgotten corner of the world, a tomb filled with the debris of the church's past. Stacks of water-stained hymn books, boxes of old, moth-eaten choir robes, and a broken wooden crucifix leaning against a damp stone wall. And then she saw him. Her father was standing in the doorway, his figure framed by the dim light. He was holding a plate with a sandwich and a glass of water. His face was calm, his expression not of anger, but of a profound, chilling resolve. "You're awake," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You need to eat." "Daddy, what is this? Where are we?" she pleaded, her mind struggling to reconcile the man she had trusted her whole life with the jailer who now stood before her. "We're safe," he replied, stepping into the room and placing the plate on the floor. "This is a storage room, beneath the basement. No one ever comes down here. No one even knows it exists." He began to explain his twisted, suffocating logic, his voice a low, reasonable monotone that was more terrifying than any shout. He wasn't punishing her. He was protecting her. He was saving her from the world, from the boys who would hurt her, from the ambitions that would take her away from him. He was preserving their family, the one thing he had left. "We'll be together here," he said, as if describing a new, cozy home. "Just like it was meant to be. I'll take care of you. I'll keep you safe forever." The word forever echoed in the small, damp room, a death sentence delivered with a chilling, paternalistic love. She was a prisoner, and her warden was the one person in the world she was supposed to be able to trust. The sanctuary where she had sung her hymns of praise, the holy ground where she had felt closest to God, had become her tomb. And the man who held the key was not just her father. He was her God now, a cruel, omnipotent being who controlled her light, her food, and her very existence. Earl Whitaker's life settled into a new, chillingly seamless routine. His existence became a masterclass in compartmentalization, a life lived on two separate, parallel tracks that never intersected. Upstairs, in the world of light and air, He was the picture of quiet, admirable resilience. He arrived at the church every morning at dawn, his movements as predictable and comforting as the rising Sunday. He would sweep the steps, tend to the small garden of roses his late wife had planted, and perform his handyman duties with a silent, monastic devotion. He became an object of profound sympathy for the congregation. They would see him sitting alone in his usual pew, his head bowed in prayer, and their hearts would break for him. "Poor Earl," they would whisper. "To lose a wife and then have a daughter run off like that. It's a miracle the man can even stand." They would bring him casseroles and plates of cookies, small offerings of kindness that served as a constant, unwitting reinforcement of his lie. He accepted their pity with a humble, grateful grace that only deepened their admiration. Downstairs, in the secret world of darkness and silence, he was a different man. He was not a grieving father. He was a methodical, efficient warden. Twice a day, he would descend the steep wooden steps into the main basement, and then unlock a second, hidden door behind a row of old filing cabinets that led to the sub-basement where Danielle was kept. He would deliver her meager meals on a tray, his face a blank, unreadable mask. He never spoke of the outside world. He never answered her desperate questions. His silence was a form of absolute control, a constant reminder that her old life was gone, and he was the sole architect of her new one. The juxtaposition of his two lives was stark and horrifying. One moment, he would be upstairs, discussing the price of copper piping with the church deacon, his voice full of practical, neighborly concern. An hour later, he would be downstairs, locking a deadbolt on his own daughter, his face devoid of any emotion at all. The man who accepted their prayers for his lost child was the very monster who had stolen her. He walked on the floorboards of the sanctuary, a symbol of faith and community, while just a few feet beneath him, his greatest sin, his living, breathing secret, was slowly, silently suffocating in the dark. In the weeks and months that followed Danielle's disappearance, Earl's carefully crafted lie began to grow, its roots sinking deep into the fertile soil of community gossip. He had planted the seed, the story of the rebellious daughter and the older, dangerous boyfriend, and now he simply had to watch it flourish. The story was whispered over cups of coffee in the church hall, discussed in hushed tones over backyard fences, and analyzed by the self-appointed matriarchs of the neighborhood. Each retelling added a new, fictional layer to the narrative, further cementing the lie and further destroying Danielle's reputation. "I always knew that girl had a wild streak," one woman would say, shaking her head with a kind of sorrowful satisfaction. "Too pretty for her own good. I heard from Susan that the boy was in a gang." Another would add, their eyes wide with a delicious, second-hand sense of drama. "Poor Earl. He tried so hard with her after Martha passed." Danielle, the girl who had been beloved for her bright spirit and her beautiful voice, was posthumously recast as a troubled, ungrateful child who had broken her poor father's heart. Her ambition, her desire to go to college, was now reinterpreted as a sign of her selfishness, her refusal to stay and care for her grieving father. Earl played his part to perfection. He would listen to their sympathetic words, his expression one of weary, paternal pain. He would sigh and say things like, "I just pray she's safe, wherever she is. I just pray that boy isn't hurting her." He was a master of manipulation, subtly guiding the narrative, ensuring that all sympathy flowed to him, and all blame fell on the phantom boyfriend and his absent, reckless daughter. This communal acceptance of the lie was a crucial part of Danielle's prison. It created a perimeter of disbelief around the truth. Even if she had managed to scream loud enough for someone to hear, who would have believed her? The entire community had already accepted that she was gone, that she had chosen to leave. Her absence was no longer a question. It was a settled, tragic fact. The gossip and the pity were more effective than any lock on a door. They were an invisible, impenetrable wall that isolated her completely, ensuring that no one would ever come looking for a girl who, by all accounts, had never wanted to be found. In the crushing, timeless silence of her subterranean prison, the sounds from the world above became Danielle's only clock, her only calendar, her only connection to a life that felt like a distant, fading dream. The most beautiful and most painful of these sounds was the music. On Sunday mornings, the faint, muffled sound of the church organ would filter down through the layers of concrete and wood. The deep, resonant tones would vibrate through the floor, a ghostly, beautiful sound that was both a comfort and a torment. She would close her eyes and picture the congregation in their pews, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, a world of light and faith that was so close, yet so impossibly far away. Then the choir would begin to sing. She could hear them, their voices a faint, angelic chorus, singing the hymns she knew by heart, the hymns she had once led. She would mouth the words, her own voice a dry, unused whisper in the darkness. It was a form of prayer, a way to connect with the person she had once been, but it was also an agony, a constant, piercing reminder of the voice that had been stolen from her, the joy that had been extinguished. To fight against the creeping madness of the timeless dark, she needed a way to mark the days. Her world had no sunrises, no sunsets, no moon to mark the passage of the nights. She had only the schedule of the church above, the choir rehearsals on Thursdays, the Sunday services, the quiet emptiness of a Monday. One day, in a moment of desperate clarity, she found a loose nail on the floor, likely dropped during some long-ago construction. With trembling hands, she began to scratch a small, straight line onto a large, damp wooden beam that ran along one wall of her cell. One line for each day. After 7 lines, she would scratch a longer, horizontal line through them. A week. This crude, secret calendar became her obsession, her reason for waking up. It was an act of profound, silent rebellion. It was a way of screaming into the void, "I am still here. I am still alive. This day belongs to me." The lines on the beam grew, a testament to her endurance. She marked her 18th birthday with a small, shaky star. She marked Thanksgiving and Christmas with crude, childlike drawings of a turkey and a tree. The calendar was a secret history of her suffering, a tangible record of the time her father was stealing from her, one day at a time. It was the one thing in her world that he did not control. It was hers. And in the suffocating darkness, it was the only thing that kept the last flickering ember of her spirit from being extinguished completely. Hope, Danielle learned, was the most dangerous drug of all. It would come in small, tantalizing flashes, a sudden noise from the basement above, an unfamiliar footstep, and her heart would leap with a wild, painful jolt. Someone is here. Someone will find me. But the footsteps would always recede, the noises would fade, and she would be left alone again in the silence, the crash from the high of hope more devastating than the despair itself. The closest she came to being discovered happened months into her captivity. It was a Tuesday, a day that was usually quiet, but on this day, she heard a new voice in the main basement, just beyond her locked door. It was a young, enthusiastic voice, full of energy and purpose. He was talking to her father. "And I just think a thorough cleaning is long overdue, Earl," the voice said. "We could get a team of volunteers from the youth group. We could clear out all this old junk, put up some new shelves. We could really make this a usable space." Danielle's heart stopped. A cleaning. They were going to clean the basement. They would have to move the old filing cabinets that blocked the hidden door to her room. They would find her. The hope that surged through her was so powerful it made her dizzy. She scrambled to the door, her ear pressed against the cold, thick wood, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and a wild, desperate excitement. She could hear her father's low, rumbling response. His voice was calm, but she, who knew the subtle undertones of his moods better than anyone, could detect a new, sharp edge of tension in it. "That's a fine idea, Deacon Miles," Earl said, his tone one of thoughtful, practical concern. "A fine idea. But not that corner." "Why not?" the deacon asked, his voice full of youthful curiosity. "That's where most of the clutter is." "Black mold," Earl replied, the lie slipping from his tongue with a smooth, practiced ease. "A bad case of it. I discovered it a few years back. It's toxic. That's why I barricaded the entrance to that old sub-storage room. It's a health hazard. The whole section needs to be professionally remediated. I've been meaning to get the church board to approve the funds." It was a brilliant lie, a perfect mixture of safety concerns and bureaucratic procedure. It was a lie that no one, especially not a young, trusting deacon, would ever question. "Oh," the deacon said, his enthusiastic voice instantly deflated. Goodness, I had no idea. Well, you're right, of course. We can't have the youth group exposed to that. You let me know what the board says. You're a good man, Earl, always looking out for the church. Danielle heard their footsteps retreat, their voices fading as they went back up the stairs. And with them, her hope vanished. She slid down the door, a choked, silent sob escaping her lips. He had done it again. He had built another wall around her, this one made not of wood and nails, but of a clever, plausible lie. Her one, brief, shining chance of discovery had been extinguished, leaving her in a darkness that now felt deeper and more absolute than ever before. In the timeless, sensory-deprived world of the hidden room, Danielle's own body became a new and terrifying landscape. The initial shock and terror of her captivity had given way to a monotonous, grinding despair. But now, a new, more insidious horror began to unfold, one that was happening from within. She was sick. It started as a profound, unshakable weariness, a deep, bone-crushing fatigue that made it a struggle to even sit up. Then came the nausea, a constant, roiling sickness in her stomach that made the meager meals her father provided an ordeal to choke down. Her body, once strong and vibrant from years of athletics and singing, began to betray her. It felt alien, a vessel that was no longer under her own control. She was weak, her limbs heavy and unresponsive, her mind clouded by a constant dull fog. Then came the changes, the subtle, terrifying shifts in the landscape of her own form. Her clothes, already loose on her thinning frame, began to feel tight in strange, new places. Her body was aching in ways she had never experienced, a deep internal soreness that had no apparent cause. She was a bright, well-educated young woman. She understood biology, but in the confused, traumatized state of her mind, she couldn't, or wouldn't, allow herself to connect the dots. The implications were too monstrous to contemplate, a level of betrayal so profound that her mind simply refused to process it. The man who brought her food, the man whose footsteps were the only measure of her days, the man who was her father. It was an abyss of horror she could not bring herself to look into, so she called it the sickness. It was a vague, amorphous term for the terror that was unfolding within her. The unspoken sickness was a secret she kept even from herself, a truth her own consciousness was fighting to suppress. It was a physical manifestation of her father's ultimate act of possession, a living, growing testament to a betrayal that went far beyond the locked door and the stolen days. Her body had become a second prison, one from which she could never escape. For 13 months, Earl Whitaker's secret world had operated with a flawless, chilling precision. His control was absolute, his routine unbreakable, his lie impenetrable. But he had made one critical, arrogant miscalculation. He had failed to account for the frail, unpredictable, and ultimately uncontrollable nature of the human body. He could no longer ignore the truth. Danielle was not just a prisoner. She was a dying prisoner. The change in her was dramatic and terrifying. The vibrant, defiant girl he had locked away had been replaced by a frail, skeletal figure with dull, vacant eyes and skin the color of old parchment. She was racked with a persistent, hacking cough, and she barely had the strength to lift the glass of water he brought her. He watched her through the small peephole he had drilled in the door. His creation, his perfect, contained world, literally wasting away before his eyes. And for the first time since he had locked that door, he felt a flicker of something other than possessive satisfaction. He felt panic. His entire, meticulously constructed life was built on the foundation of his secret. And that secret was now threatening to die. Her death would not be the end of his problem. It would be the beginning of a new, far more dangerous one. A body could be discovered. A forensic investigation would reveal the truth of her captivity, the truth of her illness. His perfect lie would unravel, and the saint of the First Baptist Church would be exposed as a monster. His all-consuming, twisted need to possess her was suddenly eclipsed by a more primal, powerful instinct, the need for self-preservation. The illusion of his love, the sick, paternalistic justification he had built for himself, evaporated in the face of his own terror. She was no longer his daughter, the last remnant of his lost wife. She was a piece of evidence. She was a liability, and she had to be disposed of. The warden, faced with the collapse of his prison, was about to become an executioner. The final act of Earl's twisted paternalistic care was as cold and methodical as every act that had preceded it. His decision was made. He would not kill her directly. His cowardice wouldn't allow for such a direct confrontation with his own monstrosity. He would simply remove her, abandon her to the elements, and let nature finish the job he had started. On a cold, moonless night in late autumn, he unlocked the door to the hidden room for the last time. Danielle was barely conscious, a bundle of rags and bones, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He wrapped her in an old, dusty blanket, the movements devoid of any tenderness. She was no longer a person to him. She was a package to be delivered. He carried her up the stairs and out of the church, her weight shockingly light in his arms. He placed her in the back of his work van, among the tools and the paint cans, and drove out of the city, away from the familiar, comforting grid of his neighborhood and into the dark, unfamiliar territory of the countryside. He drove for over an hour, until the city lights were a faint, distant glow in his rearview mirror. He turned down a deserted, unpaved road that led into a state forest, the van's headlights cutting a nervous, bouncing path through the dense, black woods. He found what he was looking for. A small, secluded clearing, far from any trail. He pulled Danielle's frail body from the van and carried her a few dozen yards into the trees, the ground thick with damp, decaying leaves. He laid her down at the base of a large oak tree, a final, cruelly gentle gesture. He looked down at her, at the daughter he had professed to love so much that he couldn't let her go. Her face was pale and still in the faint moonlight, her eyes closed. He felt nothing. No remorse, no grief, only a cold, profound sense of relief. The liability was gone. The secret was safe again. He turned and walked back to his van without a backward glance. He drove away, the crunch of the tires on the gravel the only sound in the vast, silent woods. He was returning to his life, to his role as the grieving, abandoned father, a performance he could now continue, unburdened, for the rest of his days. He had left his daughter to die alone in the dark, convinced that he had just committed the perfect, final act of erasure. Hope often arrives in the most unexpected of forms. For Danielle Whitaker, it arrived in the form of two middle-aged birdwatchers named David and Susan, who had decided, on a whim, to explore a lesser-known trail in the Cook County Forest Preserve. They were deep in the woods, their binoculars trained on the high branches of an oak tree, when Susan's foot caught on something. She stumbled, looking down to see what she had tripped over. It wasn't a root or a rock. It was a pile of what looked like old, discarded rags. David came over, annoyed at the interruption and the casual littering that marred the natural beauty of the forest. He nudged the pile with the toe of his hiking boot, intending to move it off the path, and the pile of rags groaned. A jolt of pure electric shock shot through them both. They stared in horror as they realized what they were looking at. It wasn't a pile of rags. It was a person. A young woman, emaciated and filthy, her hair a matted tangle, her skin covered in sores. She looked less like a human being and more like a feral creature that had been living in the woods for years. They knelt beside her, their bird-watching forgotten, their hearts hammering with a mixture of terror and a profound, overwhelming pity. She was alive, but just barely, her breathing a shallow, almost imperceptible flutter. "Can you hear me?" Susan whispered, her voice trembling as she gently brushed a strand of matted hair from the girl's face. "We're here to help you." The girl's eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes were dull, unfocused, but for a split second, a flicker of lucid awareness, of a mind still fighting from within the ruined prison of her body, shone through. She looked at the two strangers leaning over her, their faces etched with concern. She tried to speak, her lips cracking, her voice a dry, rasping whisper, a sound that was barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. She summoned the very last, flickering ember of her strength, the final act of a will that had refused to be extinguished. "Danielle," she breathed, the single word a monumental effort. "Danielle Whitaker." And then, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed into a deep, final unconsciousness. She had done it. She had given them her name. She had handed them the key to her past, a single fragile thread for them to follow back into the world that had forgotten her. The girl in the woods had a name, and that name was about to tear a city's comfortable lives apart. The emergency room at County General Hospital was a place of controlled, chaotic urgency. But the arrival of the Jane Doe from the woods brought a new level of hushed, horrified intensity. The doctors and nurses who worked on Danielle had seen the worst of what humanity could do to itself, but they were unprepared for the story her broken body told. She was in a state of septic shock, her body racked with a raging infection. She was severely malnourished, her weight so low that her life was hanging by a thread. Her body was a roadmap of neglect and abuse, a silent, screaming testament to a prolonged, unimaginable ordeal. As they worked to stabilize her, to pull her back from the brink of death, they began to uncover the full, devastating scope of her trauma. The lead physician, a compassionate but unflappable woman named Dr. Aris, conducted the initial examination. What she found left her, a seasoned veteran of the city's darkest tragedies, utterly speechless. The official medical report, which was immediately forwarded to the police, was a clinical, dispassionate, and utterly damning document. It detailed the life-threatening infection, the signs of long-term restraint, the vitamin deficiencies that spoke of months spent without sunlight. Each medical term was a brushstroke in a portrait of pure, monstrous evil. Then came the final, horrifying discovery, the one that made even the most hardened detectives recoil in disbelief. A routine ultrasound, performed to check for internal injuries, revealed the source of the unspoken sickness that had been ravaging Danielle's body. She was several months pregnant. The news landed like a grenade in the middle of the nascent police investigation. The runaway teenager theory, the convenient, easy story that had allowed them to close the file 13 months ago, was not just wrong, it was a grotesque, unforgivable failure. This was not a case of a rebellious girl. This was a case of a prolonged, sadistic captivity, of a level of abuse and betrayal that was almost beyond comprehension. The medical report was irrefutable. It was a scientific, undeniable testimony from the victim herself, told through the language of her wounds, her illnesses, and the impossible, tragic new life she carried within her. The police now knew they were not looking for a phantom, older boyfriend. They were looking for a monster, and Danielle had given them his name. The revelation from the hospital transformed the case from a cold file to a raging, 5-alarm fire within the Chicago Police Department. The name Danielle Whitaker was no longer just a forgotten entry in a database. It was a symbol of a catastrophic, institutional failure, and the pressure to solve the case, and to solve it now, was immense. Detective Morris, the man who had so casually dismissed Earl's story as a teenage cliché 13 months ago, was brought into his captain's office. The medical report was on the desk. Morris read it, his face draining of all color. The shame and the horror of his own lazy, biased assumption hit him like a physical blow. He had not just made a mistake. He had been an unwitting accomplice. The older boyfriend story, the entire foundation of Earl's lie, crumbled to dust in a matter of hours. A quick check of Danielle's school records and interviews with her shocked, grieving friends confirmed what should have been obvious from the start. There was no older boyfriend. There had never been a boyfriend at all. Danielle had been a focused, dedicated student, her social life revolving almost exclusively around the church and her small circle of close friends. The lie was exposed. And when a lie that perfect is exposed, the truth often lies with the person who told it. The focus of the investigation swung, with the force of a battering ram, directly onto one man. The grieving, devoted father, Earl Whitaker. The plan for the arrest was made with a kind of cold, furious efficiency. They didn't go to his house. They didn't call him down to the station. They decided to unmask him in the very place he had built his fortress of lies, the place that had given him his cover of sanctity and respectability. On a bright Sunday morning, as the final hymns were being sung, 2 unmarked police cars pulled up silently in front of the First Baptist Church of Auburn. Detectives, in plain clothes, slipped into the back of the sanctuary, their presence a jarring, secular intrusion on the holy space. They waited until the service was over, until the congregation was mingling in the church hall, sipping coffee and eating cookies. They found Earl in his element, standing near the baptismal font, accepting a sympathetic pat on the back from the deacon, his face a mask of quiet, dignified grace. Detective Morris, his own face a grim, determined mask of atonement, approached him. "Earl Whitaker," he said, his voice loud enough to cut through the cheerful chatter. Earl turned, a look of polite confusion on his face, and then he saw the detective. He saw the other officers moving to flank him, and his mask, the one he had worn so perfectly for so long, finally and completely shattered. The color drained from his face, his eyes wide with the raw, animal terror of a creature that has just been cornered. "You're under arrest," Morris said, the words echoing in the suddenly silent hall, "for the abduction and abuse of your daughter, Danielle." The congregation stared, their coffee cups frozen halfway to their lips, their faces a mixture of stunned, slack-jawed disbelief and a dawning, sickening horror. The man they had pitied, the man they had prayed for, the saint they had propped up with their casseroles and their sympathy, was a monster, and he had been standing among them, in God's house, the entire time. The unmasking of Earl Whitaker sent a tremor of horror through the community, a profound and sickening realization that the evil they had read about in newspapers, the kind that happened to other people in other places, had been living right next door, disguised as a grieving friend. The story of Danielle's captivity and survival became a citywide sensation, a horrifying cautionary tale about the danger of a plausible lie and the terrifying depths of a betrayal that defied all comprehension. The church, once a symbol of faith and community, now felt tainted, a crime scene. The congregation was left to grapple with their own unwitting role in the tragedy. Their sympathy, their gossip, their unquestioning acceptance of Earl's story, it had all been a part of Danielle's prison, a wall of social reinforcement that had kept her buried. The weight of that collective guilt was a heavy, suffocating thing. But the final, most important scene of the story did not belong to the reeling community or the disgraced monster. It belonged to the survivor. In the quiet, sterile room of the hospital, Danielle began the long, arduous, and uncertain journey back to the world of the living. She was surrounded by the love she had been starved of for so long, her friends, her extended family, and a team of dedicated doctors and counselors. Her physical recovery would be a marathon of medicine and nutrition, but her emotional recovery, the healing of a soul that had been so profoundly wounded, was a journey with no map. There were days of deep, silent withdrawal and days of raw, uncontrollable grief. But there were also moments, small but powerful, of the old Danielle flickering through. A faint, small smile at a friend's familiar joke, the way her eyes would follow the flight of a bird outside her window, a quiet request for a radio, so she could listen to the music she had once created. The story of her survival was a testament to a strength she never knew she possessed. It was the strength that had allowed her to scratch a calendar onto a beam in the dark, to hold onto her own identity in the face of absolute erasure, and to summon the last of her energy to whisper her own name to a pair of strangers in the woods. The final, haunting image of her ordeal was discovered by a forensic detective who was processing the hidden room beneath the church. He swept his flashlight beam across the damp wooden walls, and there it was, a series of crude, desperate scratches on a large support beam. 13 distinct groups of lines, a silent, powerful testament to 13 stolen months. It was Danielle's calendar, the secret record of her endurance. It was the proof that even in the deepest, most absolute darkness, a single determined human spirit can refuse to be extinguished. It was the story of a girl who had been to hell and back, and who had chosen, against all odds, to live.